Okay, so enough talking, I guess. I will give the voice to our special guest today, Mike Blend. I think you will introduce yourself, so yeah, enjoy.
All right. Thank you. So I have a bit of a problem I have to share. Maybe you can appreciate the dilemma. This is kind of a big, long talk. There's a lot of words, and I don't remember all of them. Therefore, I usually have my iPad with me with the notes on them because I don't trust presenter mode. But at the same time, I need to click to advance the slides. And the problem tonight is that usually it's a two-handed job. But the beer here is so delicious, I have to admit, that I'm going to have to improvise a three-hand technique here. So, but that's actually fitting for the subject of this talk, right? You have to adapt, you have to be ready for change, and this talk is about change. Specifically, it's about the rainbow of death model that helps explain how my fellow instigators and I cross the chasm between us and the rest of our fellow Googlers to make automated testing a standard development practice. And I'm hoping it'll inspire you to break free from whatever standard narrative you're locked up in so you can overcome your own challenges. But first, allow me to share the story of how I earned the privilege to speak to you today. From the very beginning, I've always felt compelled to push boundaries and assert my own truth. And whenever my friends, the world would say, hey, you should do the same thing everybody else is doing with their life, I would do something different. The standard narrative never applied to me. But eventually it turned out I didn't have as much talent in music to match my ambition, and I gave programming a try, and it turned out to be a lot of fun. So my first job after college, I would carry this gym bag with my library every day. I had these books and a few more. And my friends at work would make fun of me all the time, carrying my library up and down the stairs. But then one day, we ended up on a death march, which if you're not familiar with this term, it's basically a crushing experience of trying to deliver impossible features by an impossible deadline on a fragile, untested code base that barely works to begin with. And so this was a pretty horrible experience, and to be honest, I was not a nice person while it was going on. But somehow we did it. We met the spec by the deadline, and the customer told us, hey, do whatever you can for as long as you need, just make the damn thing faster now. So it was during this period of relative calm and stability that I discovered unit testing. Completely by accident. I happened to go in a bookstore one night and get a copy of the C and C++ Users Journal, had an article about unit testing, and I thought, that's a neat idea. So I was starting to rewrite this subsystem from the ground up, and I had my library and my newfound unit testing practice to help me. So every time I'd write a function or a class, I would exercise it thoroughly with fast, focused tests, rather than wait to put the whole system together to see if anything worked. And so, long story short, in the end, this new subsystem, not only did it work, it sped up the entire system by 18 times. And when there was a bug or two that showed up, I could investigate, reproduce, fix, validate, and ship a new version the same day, when the standard back in the early 2000s was maybe the next week, if not the next month. So I was really successful with my automated testing practice, and my teammates, they recognized my abilities, but they never adopted testing, and I couldn't figure out why. So in my infinite wisdom at that age, I decided the solution was to sell my house and quit my job and somehow accidentally meet a woman on an online dating site who could refer my resume to Google. Yeah, that's how I got my foot in the door at Google. Not MIT or Stanford or open source. Online dating of all things. So back in 2005, Google, was already well known for being a great place. You had all these smart people, and there was a knowledge sharing culture. all this compute power, more than you could imagine, even back then. But of course, the most important thing was the food. All the food. And so at the time, Google appeared to have zero of the typical organizational bullshit. The company served the people, and the people served the mission. It's the way it ought to be. But with all that freedom and food came a great deal of responsibility, not just to users and customers, but also to one another. There were already a bunch of standard practices built into the culture by the time I arrived. Everybody was expected to conform to style idioms, to send their code for review and to do code reviews for other people. They were expected to spread knowledge through documentation and exercises and tech talks, and to just basically communicate with, collaborate with, and support one another. And all of this kept silos from forming, so each developer, as well as the company as a whole, could expand their capabilities very rapidly. So we had this responsibility to help each other improve our code, our products, I keep wanting to say country, forgive me, I'm American, and ourselves. But even though Google was doing so many things right, very few developers were writing unit tests. Why not? I'm pretty sure that back then, I don't even know about today, but certainly in 2005, the MIT and Stanford grad programs in computer science were not teaching unit testing. And very few people had been on a death march. And very few people in general had been exposed to automated testing concepts or tools or anything like that. They just had no experience to understand the value. And on top of that, the company seemed capable of doing little wrong at the time. Stock price kept going up, the number of developers kept growing and growing. How could we claim that a lack of testing was hurting it? The fact is, it was impossible to prove objectively. But the company's entire belief system was based on data-driven decision-making, which, generally speaking, is a wonderful thing. It's obviously been great for Google. It's been great for many social institutions, if you will. But it did mean that we could not objectively prove that an investment in learning how to do unit testing or any automated testing was going to be worth it, that it was going to pay dividends. Still, some of us felt that the company was at risk of collapsing under its own success because the size and complexity of the code and the products were exploding with this growth, this nonstop growth. And even though Google tried to hire the best and provide them with a supportive environment, the development operation was just getting so big, it was starting to break down. And no project was a better example of this than the Google Web Server, or GWS for short. Excuse me, I have to take a break here. Man, that's good. I love hoppy beers. Anyways, GWS, Google Web Server, the server that runs the google.com homepage. Now, I wasn't actually a member of this team, but as we'll see, I was close with some of the members. So in 2004, actually, this was not a great assignment. There was nothing glamorous about it. It was basically a dumping ground for all these other teams that were developing cool search features that they wanted to get in the homepage so they could show grandma. But imagine if you break google.com or allow it to be broken. You know, search results could come back bad or unacceptably slow, and so all of these thousands of queries per second turn into thousands of broken promises. And that means you're not just losing money, but customer trust. So when Bart Metarata became tech lead of this team, he thought automated testing would go a long way towards fixing these problems of complexity and fragility. So he got the team to take a hard line. They weren't going to have any more changes going into GWS that didn't have an automated test. And they also set up a continuous build. They kept it passing religiously. They made sure that their coverage went up over time. They had a policy and a guide and enforced that all the team members and everybody trying to submit changes from outside followed both those documents. And so this wasn't a very popular policy, but the team held firm and turned a corner. They became one of the most productive teams in the whole company, integrating a large number of changes, not just their own, but changes from other teams, while maintaining a brisk release schedule. And new team members could actually do real work really quickly because they had such good test coverage and code health. So ultimately, this radical policy enabled the Google.com homepage to expand its capabilities rapidly and thrive in an amazingly competitive and fast-moving technology landscape. But even though GWIS was a model of automated testing effectiveness, it was still a relatively small team in a large and growing company. And there were so many other forces that we'll take a look at, and so many, I guess, personalities, if you will, at play, on top of the fact that we couldn't prove the value of testing with data. And all of this meant that the GWIS message, the GWIS story, was getting drowned out by Google's standard narrative. So we had to find other ways to amplify the message and to cross the chasm. So if you're not familiar, this chasm model comes from a book called Crossing the Chasm. It's by an author named Jeffrey Moore with a G. And it talks about how the population, different segments of the population will adopt new technology differently, really adopt change differently. And so he first talks about the innovators and the early adopters. And these are the like-minded seekers that I call instigators. They're the ones on the bleeding edge, chasing the future. But the thing is, they're so bleeding edge that if everybody worked the way they do, nothing would get done. Everything would be disrupted all the time. Over here, the early majority acts sort of like a filter for the instigators. They're actually sympathetic to change. They're willing to try new things, but they need something that works. And they're going to give us constructive feedback on the most promising ideas to make sure that the good ideas get the attention they deserve. The late majority, we're going to run out of real estate here with the screen and screen, I'm sorry. But the late majority, this is sort of the institutional backbone here, the institutional memory. They're not eager for change, but when they see something working for everybody else, they'll make it standard procedure. So they're sort of a stabilizing force in the process. And then at the end, what you can't see at the bottom, these are the laggards. These are the people who will shout down any new idea, or questioning its value, or just outright denying its value. Sorry, I've never done that before. I wonder how that comes out. But the laggards, they moan and they yell and they say, everything sucks. But at the same time, that kind of direct, unfiltered feedback can inspire the instigators to find new common ground they never expected to, and consequently come up with better solutions. So the key here is getting the right messaging to the right people in the right order. And crossing the chasm is the critical component of ensuring that an initiative will be successful. And what I've laid down across the chasm that wasn't in the original book is the rainbow of death. So this isn't my original model. I stole it from my friend Albert Wong, another ex-Googler. But I gave it the funny name. I gave it this name 2 years ago just because I thought it sounded weird, and it appealed to me. But as we'll see, psychologically, I guess something was going on. By the end of the talk, this will make sense. But the point is, the steps on this little bridge here explain the different things that the instigators have to do to make sure that an initiative succeeds in crossing the chasm. So intervene. This is where the instigators, they're the experts. So they have to write the tools for everybody. And if something, there's a critical issue that comes up, they're the ones that have to roll up their sleeves and fix it. Validate. This is where the instigators come up with basically a way to measure progress, to demonstrate to the early majority, keep it up, you're doing great, and they can actually see things happening. Inform. It's where the instigators teach the early majority how to do the right thing the right way, hopefully for the right reasons. And inspire. The instigators create this vision of the future, talking about how great the world is going to be once everybody's doing this new thing. And mentor. This is where the instigators are building relationships and communities. Oh, am I still? Okay. Okay, yeah, we're good. I was just making sure. Suddenly I got quieter. I wasn't sure if I was eating the microphone or what. Yeah, mentor, that's it. Relationships, community, giving people some, one-on-one advice and coaching. And then finally, when we get to empowerment, the early majority doesn't really need the instigators anymore. They know what the right thing to do is. They know how to do it. They have the power to do it. They've become experts themselves. And whoa, I forgot to put my little caffeine on here. There we go. That won't happen again. So looking at this thing, it makes a nice little linear, well, hold on, because I clicked something else. This one's not responding. There we go. So we've got this, little dimensional line here showing that on this side, you're depending on the experts to take care of things and to define, issues and solutions. And then over here, you have the early majority becoming more and more independent. And someone I showed this to, someone I met randomly that happened to be an HR exec at some tech company, I can't remember. She looked at this and said, oh, over here, you're dealing with hard technical skills. And over here, you're dealing with people skills, which, 2 years I've been giving this talk, and that didn't occur to me, but it's true. You need to have the technical ability to, address issues and solve problems, but then you actually have to fulfill the people part of the equation too. And also, this looks linear, right? But as we'll see, it's not necessarily linear. We can do a little bit of each area at a time, using whatever we can at the moment, and then eventually go back and fill in the parts that need more attention. And also, it helps us understand. We may be doing a lot of random things, a lot of people doing stuff everywhere, but once you fit it into the picture, you can see it's not scattered, it's actually reinforcing one another. So, where am I? So the instigators, they're the ones that have to build this bridge across the chasm. And those of us at Google who were the testing instigators, we did have a lot of advantages despite the forces working against us. We had access to information, tools to help us discover that information. One of the tools we had was the Friday afternoon TGIF meeting where we'd all show up for information and beer. So cheers to TGIF. We had this freedom to define a vision and to kind of pursue that on part of our time. But we also had freedom to join forces with other like-minded people to tackle issues together. And so that's how we ended up with the testing grouplet. Bart joined forces with Nick Glasecki in 2005 to create this volunteer group. Perhaps you're already familiar with 20% time, but just in case not, it's basically the freedom that Googlers have to spend roughly a day a week on something other than their main project. So a grouplet is a bunch of people that take that time and create a team to address an issue that affects the company. And so, of course, in our case, it was testing. And eventually, I did become one of the leads of this group. So that's how I ended up close with Bart and close with the GWIS people. But anyways, we had very little budget and zero authority. But we did have a lot of freedom to try creative, crazy things to chip away at the problems that were facing testing adoption. And we used the GWIS experience as a model. And speaking of models, I'm throwing a lot of models up here. Just one more, to kind of tie this all together. Let's talk about the change process through the lens of Kurt Lewin's theory of social change. He talks about how in the beginning you have to break bad habits. You have to unfreeze the behavior you want to change. Then you have to change the behavior to something better and then refreeze it. This is where it becomes established procedure. And while this is happening, you have forces driving change and forces restraining it. So we believed that Googlers were becoming more and more frozen in an unsustainable pattern, and that automated testing was necessary to break it. But at the same time, there were a lot of things working against automated testing adoption. So people were under intense pressure. Well, first of all, they had little to no experience with testing to begin with, other than the brittleness and the slowness of the status quo. And then on top of that, they were under a lot of pressure to deliver features while feeling intimidated by many of their peers. And this is where I like to point out that for 6 years, I don't know how Google didn't realize their hiring mistake, and they actually let me stay there until I left. And most people at Google probably wonder the same thing, even if they've been there longer. But the point being, how could we blame people for not testing when they couldn't afford the time to learn? And economists have a term for this. They call it temporal discounting. Basically, we can ask people, okay, you can ship your code now without tests, or you could take the time to learn about testing and experiment. And yeah, the tools are slow and it's going to take a long time, but you might prevent a problem in the future. You might, maybe not, maybe it'll never happen, but you might solve, you might keep something bad from happening. Well, you're just going to ship your feature, right? Like, it's too much trouble to learn how to test. The tools are slow. And it was impossible to reach a state of flow to begin with, just trying to write your code in the first place. So this combination of immediate pain and slow feedback in pursuit of a distant, unclear benefit made the right thing way harder than it needed to be. And so arguing with people that, my code is too hard to test, you're wrong, I don't have time to test, you're wrong, this would have been counterproductive, because these complaints arose from real issues, things that we needed to address first, things that emerged from Google's standard narrative that the standard narrative wasn't going to solve. So we started experimenting, started to chip away at this problem bit by bit using what we had in the beginning. And one of the things I'm not going to talk about up here, one of the things we tried that it didn't work out, but it was fun, but we did have beer and ice cream socials. It's like, hey, let's have beer and ice cream and talk about testing. Well, we went through some beer and ice cream at least. It was fun. Anyways, one of the first things we did is we worked with Eng.edu. This is our like I'm still there. This is the internal training organization. And they helped, produce a lot of different training activities and materials. They helped us develop these code labs. They were basically wiki pages with exercises people could walk through. Based on that, we also produced a Noogler lecture. In case you haven't figured it out, that means new Googler. Yeah, they were very cute. They would actually, when you were a Noogler, they give you like one of those multicolored hats with a little propeller on top. Yeah. It was fun. But anyway, so we had a lecture that was part of the first 2 weeks of training. It says, here is what unit testing is about. And we also worked with them to give tech talks, either people internally talking or people visiting from outside. And we'd often give away free books. Come to the talk, we'll give you a book. Man, were those talks popular. And the books. Something else that we had to do is we had to play with words. We introduced this new terminology, small, medium, and large tests. The reason why we had to do that is that at the time, with all these MIT and Stanford graduates, their definition of a unit test was any test that ran in less than 5 minutes. Yeah, I see a lot of confused looks. I love that moment. Oh, that's so great. Yeah, minutes, 5 minutes, not even seconds. Anything that took longer? Regression test. Yeah. So we had to get rid of that baggage. We decided to introduce a new terminology, still somewhat intuitive, but we could very rigorously define what is a small test and what is it good for. Same with medium, same with large. Of course, we knew we were talking about unit integration and system tests, but all those Stanford kids were none the wiser. Finally, we worked really closely with tools teams to drive the innovation in tooling that finally took away the I don't have time to test excuse. So here we go. I promise you we would see this in action. And now over time, we could see the pieces coming together, the things we were doing in the early days in 2005. Notice the emphasis on inform. Like, the natural first thought is like, oh, people just don't know how to do this stuff. If we give them the information, they'll start doing it. The truth will set them free. Speaking as an American, I think I can definitively say that information and facts alone we've observed are not always sufficient to change people's worldviews and behaviors. So we had to find another way around the issue. But the nice thing was this exercise enabled us to kind of develop a message and language to be very clear about what we wanted to teach the rest of the company. Still, early 2006 comes, we're getting desperate. We're giving all these talks, we're doing all the training, we're giving away all these books, and people just aren't testing. Why not? So we were trying to think of, like, what could we do? We need some quarterly goals. What's the craziest thing we could think of? And so we thought of something pretty crazy, and it turned out to be our best idea: testing on the toilet. This was, is our weekly testing newsletter. It's been coming out every week since sometime in 2006, and is still going. And the idea here is we could just put a little bit of knowledge out there, a little bit at a time, where people were guaranteed to absorb it when they had nothing better to do. And this would gradually raise the degree of testing knowledge and sophistication throughout the company. And then people would go back to their desk and apply some new tool or technique that they learned in their spare time. And so eventually, what happened is we already had the official style guides that said how you have to write your code. People would start using these sort of like the style guides. Like, hey, I learned about this technique, and that's why I'm using it. Or, hey, I was thinking about your code in the bathroom and got an inspiration. You really should try this thing. It was pretty great. So what we eventually realized is that a lot of teams were starting to get interested in testing, but they just didn't know where to start. So we developed a roadmap for them that we called Test Certified. Oh, and by the way, this episode, I'll have a link at the end of the talk to the slides. You can go to the slides, blow up this image. This episode talks about Test Certified and the next thing that I'll talk about. But the idea is, we've got 3 different levels that tell you, start here and proceed. And this did 2 things. One, it hacked the culture, because Googlers love measuring things, especially things that make them look good when it's time for performance review. And second, it really did overcome that scary obstacle of like, whoa, I don't know where to start, right? We told them where to start and how to proceed. And we would also give them mentors along with enrollment in the program that could coach them along the path and provide insight and moral support and validate that they had achieved level 1, 2, or 3. So this is a team of internal consultants that I was a member of as well. And we would go into a project for months at a time and actually do all the things that we do, with the techniques and the tools on the team's code. And we use Test Certified as both a guide as well as a goal for the engagement. And plus, we were working really closely with the tools teams, taking the new tools and using them on really hard projects and giving them feedback right away. So this just accelerated the innovation in tooling. We can see more of the picture coming together here. And of course, Test Certified, you could say, oh, it also informs and inspires and mentors. That would just get crazy up here. The most, I think, salient thing is this validation function. It gave people a way to see themselves making progress. And almost as importantly, gave a way for other people to see them making progress so they could say nice things during performance review. And we also sweetened the deal by providing build orbs. So these were like little glass glowy things that a team could sit in, on somebody's desk, and they could see if the build was passing when it's green or failing when it's red. And people would get really attached to these things. There would be like this, emotional bond. And when the orb was red, it's like, oh, it's so unhappy. We need to make it happy again. Let's make the orb green again. And it was also really fun for the grouplet because you can't just have one orb. What kind of a world do we live in if we only have one orb? So we would have orb hacking parties, and different offices would do the orb their way. And in New York, by the time I got to New York, we had the Statue of Liberty orb. We take a Statue of Liberty model about this big and put an Arduino in it, and then run a wire up to the torch. So the torch would be the build indicator. Yeah, it was pretty great. And then on top of that, we started engaging in the proud Google tradition of organizing volunteer Fixits. So what a Fixit is a day when a bunch of volunteers say, hey, everybody else in the company, let's spend a day doing something important but not urgent, such as writing tests, fixing broken tests, maybe climbing the test certified ladder. And the really nice property of these events is they were big and fun, and it generated a lot of energy, really a critical mass from both the people organizing the event and the people participating in it. So by the time you were done with one of these, you just reached a new plateau in terms of testing awareness and adoption. So 2 years in, we're really starting to roll. This is starting to really come together. But things were starting to drift apart. You had the grouplet, but you also had Test Certified becoming its own entity. The Test Mercenaries was its own team. Testing on the Toilet was pretty independent. I started to feel like I was the last link between all these divergent initiatives. So I started running around to people and saying, we need a strategy. We've got to find like some common mission to tie us all back together again. And eventually we came up with it. We wanted to get all projects to Test Certified Level 3 within 2 years. Thing is, we didn't actually care if all the projects were literally in Test Certified. We just wanted to reach a tipping point so that all of the projects had to function as though they were Test Certified Level 3. And this also really worked out for our QA team, for our test engineers, software engineers, and test, because it gave them a framework to collaborate with their developers. They said, hey, if you do Test Certified and do better automated testing up front, then I'm not just coming back to you all the time saying your code sucks, I found another one of your stupid bugs. You know, I'm actually going to come back with some higher value input, like, oh, this is what it feels like to a user. I noticed these performance characteristics, you know, the things that humans are good at, rather than just finding bugs that the developers could have caught in the first place. So what's the next step here? Yeah, next step is to take a sip. So notice something about this picture. This empowerment side is a little bit light. Sure, there was some tool development going on, but most people weren't using the tools that the mercenaries were using, or that the big projects were using. So we needed a way to get the rest of the company to use new tools. And it turned out, wait, Fixits are really great for that. So we ran the Revolution Fixit, January 31st, 2008. And that was the event that put the first huge dent in the I don't have time to test excuse, because suddenly people had new build infrastructure. They didn't have to build and test everything on their workstation. They could, farm that work out to the cloud. Now, of course, not all projects could do that right away. They had to fix things. That's why we had to fix it. And what did they have to fix? Well, two things. One, they had to clean up their dependencies. Like, there were just dependencies all over the place that didn't need to be there anymore, and it was a mess. That was making things slow because you had to check out all this extra code you didn't even need, but you still had to build it and whatever. The other thing is that people had to check in all of their build inputs to source control. Now, some people are thinking, wait, they weren't doing that already? I saw like the flash of eyes from one side to the other. No, they weren't doing that, because remember, we had one source repository, we had all this new code going in, things were getting slow. People hacked the system. They started saving all kinds of things in NFS filers rather than checking it into Perforce. So in order to use the new tools, though, in order for the system to build everything in the cloud, you had to check everything into Perforce. Now, when you do that, when you clean up your dependencies, all your build inputs are controlled, and suddenly everything is faster, you have time to test. All the things that you didn't have time to learn to do before, suddenly you do. And everybody was happy to do this because everything was so slow and so sucky. You could not go 5 minutes without having a conversation about how bad the build sucked until this day. And I'm not exaggerating, I'm really not. So what was my next line? I wish I could, line. Oh yeah, not everybody participated in the revolution. But everybody was affected by it. Like, you could walk down the halls and hear teams talking about, yeah, this week we're going to revolutionize our build. Some people just hadn't planned to do it that day, but they were totally hooked by the new tool set. And so a few months later, after most projects were revolutionized, something else happened that I think demonstrated the value of automated testing and the testing grouplet's influence. So I'm not saying here that the testing grouplet was responsible for saving Google during the financial crisis of 2008, but I can tell you what happened. They didn't get rid of any full-time employees, but they got rid of a lot of contractors. And most of those people were manual testers, and also quite a few test mercenaries, because we had staffed up quickly with contractors. But what didn't happen is there wasn't a big crisis. There wasn't suddenly all these bugs and we have to slow everything down because people can't deal with anything anymore. We lost our testers, right? No, things just kept going as quickly as they ever did. And I believe that's because we had reached a tipping point where enough people knew what the right thing to do was, and they had the power to do it. The right thing had become easy enough. So, here we are, 3.5 years. And we had saturated the culture. We had all the momentum to finish building that bridge, but it still took another 1.5 years. And this is going to be anticlimactic because the thing that fades in is right here, right by my feet that you can't see. But it talks about the TAP Fixit, TAP, T-A-P, for Test Automation Platform. So this was the centralized continuous integration platform for all the projects in Google, built on the revolutionized tools. And before the TAP Fixit, teams would have their continuous builds, and they had to maintain them, and they were kind of flaky. You'd start a build, and before that finished, there'd be all these changes, and then your build would break, and you'd have to do some sort of binary search to figure out it was a mess. After TAP, by the time you looked up and noticed your build was broken, what would happen is you'd look in TAP, you'd see exactly what broke you. You'd go to the code review, you'd see a dozen other people had already jumped on that change, and the author had either fixed the breakage or rolled it back, so that by the time you looked up again, your build was passing. So that was immense power. And after that, pretty much everybody had a passing continuous build. They held each other accountable. You couldn't get away with not breaking somebody else's build. And so after 5 years of breaking from Google's standard narrative, when success was not certain for most of it, we had succeeded in making automated testing an indispensable practice of Google development culture. So that was about 2010. So what did it look like 5 years later? It took 5 years. What happened 5 years later? So Rachel Potvin from the tools team gave a talk at the At Scale conference in 2015, and it's called Why Google Stores Billions of Lines of Code in a Single Repository. And she had some astonishing numbers, as you can see. And while her talk goes through a whole host of other tools that comprise the ecosystem that makes this possible, she makes a point of saying specifically, TAP is our automated test infrastructure without which this model would completely fall apart. So, why do I keep telling this story? Well, the reason is I want people to understand Google's human. I want to make this story accessible to people, to kind of provide insight into the strengths and vulnerabilities and flaws of the humans that were involved in the company. And in understanding and empathizing with these people, hopefully we can better see how our own thoughts and behaviors and actions influence the course of events and draw the strength we need to stand up in the arena and help create a better future. Really, I just want an excuse to put this amazing Pink Floyd image in here. This is where it's called Pink Floyd Live at Pompeii. They're just like jamming in the middle of a ruined Colosseum. It's epic, epic, and that's what I'm going for. But anyways, despite hearing all this and trying to make it accessible, some people, maybe some of you even, just see me and hear me and see the scarlet G, the mark of the outsider, the person who's like unusual. Their experiences don't apply to anyone else. These people sometimes say, Google special. You had all these young, smart people that were willing to take risks. But the thing is, remember, it's just an organization. It has some smart people, some brilliant people, but sometimes they're ignorant and kind of jerks. It's just like anywhere else. And yeah, there were a lot of young people straight out of college, but then they were listening to the people who'd been in the Valley for 10 or 20 years who had also never heard of automated testing. So it still took 5 years to get all these young, smart, risk-taking people to get with the program. And only a handful of us were driving this during the entire 5-year period. Or, you know, you might think, oh, this Google guy, like he thinks he's so smart. Like, what happened to Google? Everybody has to do things Google's way. Well, it's true. It was pretty cool. I learned a lot, got some really good ideas. But does that mean now I'm supposed to forget them? I'm not supposed to share them? You know, when I join a company, it's just not even worth saying, hey, maybe we could try this. I mean, I'm not saying, certainly I'm not saying you could do everything we did the way we did it and expect the same result. But maybe there's some ideas there that would actually adapt to your organization, your problems, and provide value. And also, the other thing I like to point out, you know, we were so smart and lucky, it took us 2 years of playing around desperately with ideas before we finally came up with the big vision. If we had waited to come up with the big vision and the big plan up front, we probably wouldn't have accomplished anything. Because, see, this talk isn't about the flyers we put in the bathrooms of the certification program or specific tools that we developed and rolled out in these big, fun Fixit events. The real tool is this framework, this rainbow of death. So it's a tool for helping examine, why did this stuff work? You know, how can you develop some empathy for maybe the people who are presenting you with cultural challenges? How can you understand their fears and their needs so you can actually produce solutions that work for everybody? How can you break free from the standard narrative that's holding everyone back? So, you know, I don't want to just keep telling the story and have people listen and say, oh, that's a nice little story about Google. I want people to hopefully take something away that's of value. But yeah, we had some advantages, you know. It was kind of lucky to get hired by Google. We had some, you know, information and tools at our disposal. But those numbers of Rachels wouldn't have existed if we just sat on our asses and didn't try crazy things to fix the problem. And we also didn't run around telling people that they were stupid or dangerous for not testing. Because while the technological advances, like they were important, we had to do those things in order to make the right thing the easy thing. But the greater challenge was creating the cultural space necessary for lasting change. We had to be patient with ourselves to kind of figure out the shape of the problem and the solutions that would work in our culture. And we had to be patient with our colleagues to kind of adopt what we were trying to teach them over time. And, you know, of course, most of those days, whenever I'd see a code change go out for review and it didn't have any tests, and somebody just approved it without asking for any tests, I would get furious. I'd like want to run up to people. I'd like want to shake them and be like, don't you know how dangerous and irresponsible you're being? Just stop that. Don't you know how much harm you're doing your company? It's still hard not to say country sometimes. But I think it's pretty obvious that that approach isn't really going to win people over to understanding and hopefully adopting your own worldview. So that's the thing. Not everybody has the same open mind or life experiences or educational background. Everybody has their own specific worldview. And they feel like their mind is the right balance of open and closed, whether they're actually seeking the truth and questioning it to reaffirm it, or if they're just happy as they are and never questioning the truth. And so as instigators, it's our job to accept that and work with it. For example, right now, I have the privilege of standing before you and deciding the path and presentation of this narrative, and trying to inspire you, everybody in the audience, to go forth with these big ideas and make change happen. And for each of you who are looking at me just like this, this is very personal. Your focus is on the effect my words and ideas are having on your own thoughts, and you have your own reasons for why some of what I say actually resonates, and maybe some things I say don't. And what you think is like brilliant, you know, the person who you're thinking of back at the office, oh, they really need to hear this. They might think that I'm full of shit. Or they might hear it and think like, oh, you know, cool story, bro, but, you know, our project's a snowflake and that wouldn't work here because of stupid reason X or Y. Or they might think it is a really good idea and they don't feel like they have the power or the safety to act on it. And always, to a vocal and tenacious minority, we will be the opposition party. So there's little we can do to fight this, and we wouldn't really gain anything from it. We have to succeed despite that. And we can't rely solely on logic and metrics to change minds. I mean, metrics are very important for marking and demonstrating progress. Our logic must be as tight as it can be. But these things are far from sufficient to inspire action in either the skeptical or the powerless. Metrics and arguments don't change most minds. Experiences do. And so in order to create the necessary experiences, you have to figure out what's the real pain and the real fear and address that. You can't get caught up in whether or not people have the right to feel or complain about that pain, whether they're entitled or stupid or anything. It's not your job to judge the people, to judge their pain. It's your job to understand what's going on and to fix the problem. Because the problem you want to solve may not be the problem that you have to solve first. Now, of course, this doesn't feel right. It feels contrary to every instinct that you have to meet opposition with with a greater force. But that's because it's always easier to attack than to engage. That's what the standard narrative is. The most important thing to remember about that standard narrative is that's the very thing that created the situation we want to change. And again, I keep referring to being an American. This is a very personal thing, not just about automated testing, but back home, we have a lot of this going on. The thing is, the standard narrative is comprised of the motions we go through to perform business as usual with an incomplete or mistaken awareness of the downstream consequences. So how can we change other people's worldviews if we can't change our own? And this, sorry, getting a little dry-throated here. Let me recover. This is where I finally figured out what the word death meant in the title. Because it's about the death of our own ideas and our own ego, about what's wrong with people or wrong with the world. And if we cling to these ideas, from the fear that everything's going to fall apart if we do, there's little hope that we'll actually discover the real solution, that we can cross the chasm to connect with people, heal the pain, and make change. So this rainbow of death, this stupid little idea, can help you approach your own problems with clarity and empathy, with an open heart as well as an open mind, as you try to break from the standard narrative and find ways to cross the chasm that are the best fit for your environment. So I love throwing this up here. It's one of my favorite paintings, Caravaggio's David with the Head of Goliath. And I've had some friends who review the talk say, oh, it's too military, it's so morbid, it should be uplifting at this point. And to me, it is. To me, this is a breakthrough moment of self-awareness because if you don't know the history of this painting, it's a self-portrait of Caravaggio as Goliath. So just like Caravaggio discovered after battling his demons over the course of a lifetime, those of us in the testing group realized, the forces that were opposing us weren't external. It was the way that we already saw the world. It was our own identity, our own instincts, our own culture. Often the greatest obstacle to the change we want to make is the way we as individuals or organizations or even society at large continues to see the world. So now it's time to ask you, the audience, what is the pain that people feel in your environment? Where is it coming from? And how can you give them the knowledge and the power necessary to overcome it? What resources do you have available? What other instigators are close by that are waiting to help in this mission? What can you do to intervene, validate, inform, inspire, mentor, and empower your people? And how much longer can you afford to wait before taking action? Will you decide to follow the standard narrative or choose your own? And thank you.